everybody and welcome back to my channel. So today's video is a little bit different to my recent videos. I've actually decided to do another ScribbleTips video. Now if you're unaware what that is, quite a while ago I did a video and it had tips on doing inking lines and line art, that kind of thing, and I called it ScribbleTips, which is a terrible pun. So I actually decided to do another one again and make it a series because I initially planned to make it a series. However, I didn't get back into making another one. So yeah, today I'm actually decided to do another one, and it's going to be on Copic Markers because, to be honest, that's what I use the most, and I think I might have some good tips to recommend. There are 4 types of Copic marker: sketch, chow, wide and classic. Personally, I prefer the chow or the sketch because they both have a brush nib and a chisel nib. The chows are cheaper and more affordable, but they hold less ink, and the sketch holds more ink, and you can also use it in the Copic airbrush system. The classic marker, on the other hand, does hold even more ink than the sketch, but I prefer not to use it because it has a bullet nib instead of a brush nib. However, if you do prefer a bullet nib, this is a good one for you. You can also use it in the airbrush system, which is pretty cool. There's also the Copic Wide, which I actually haven't ever used, but that marker is pretty good for filling in large spaces of area. However, it is important to note that it only has one nib, which is a chisel nib, hence wide. All markers are refillable. Once I heard someone say that chows aren't refillable, but that simply is not true. To refill the marker, you just need to remove both caps of the marker and drip the ink onto the chisel nib. You need to remove both caps so that the ink can flow freely from one end to the other. You can also remove the chisel nib and pour the ink directly into the marker barrel. However, you probably should be careful because you don't want to overfill the marker, because that can actually cause it to drip everywhere, and you don't want to waste that precious, expensive various ink. Once the brush tip looks shiny, the marker is full. If your marker seems to drip ink for no apparent reason, try taking off both caps and let it sit for a moment. That should allow the pressure inside the barrel to return to normal. Sometimes this happens if you drop your marker or if you fill it with ink without having both caps removed. To transfer ink onto your blender marker, touch the tips of the 2 markers together for a few seconds, and the colours from the markers will mix a bit on the nibs. The blender marker will have some of the darker colour, and also the darker marker will also appear a lighter shade as well. This is a way of blending the markers together, especially when you just want a very light colour, or if you want to blend a colour into white. As you colour using these markers, the colour will gradually change back to its original tone. There's also another way you can transfer ink onto a blender. Scribble the coloured marker over a non-porous surface like an empty photo frame or a glass palette. Then pick up the ink by drawing over the area you coloured. You don't have to use the colourless blender for these. You can also use a lighter and a darker shade that you want to mix. Mixing colours on the nib does not damage the marker. To clean out the nib of the marker, scribble onto a scrap piece of paper and it will return to its previous state. You can also use the colourless blender to add texture and different effects to your work. For example, I like to drip some colourless blender on a coloured background to create a bubble-like effect, because the alcohol in the ink pushes it away from where you've dripped. It's also good to note that the colourless blender is also good for cleaning your markers. If you have some ink on your marker cap or on the marker itself, you can easily clean it with the colourless blender solution or the marker itself. You can also use rubbing alcohol, which is essentially the same thing. As for blending, I like to work from light to dark. You can always darken a part of an artwork, but it's not very easy to lighten it afterwards. You can lighten it with the color blender a little bit, but not a lot, so be careful. Color in small circles to get an even blended look. If the coloring looks patchy, that just means you need to add more layers. I also sometimes like to use the chisel nib to color in large flat areas, but that's just my personal preference. Another tip is to use layers. A lot of the time when I color in skin, I will use a color underneath the skin tones. I like purple in the shadows and pink in the flushed parts. That gives it a more lively and dynamic feel to it. You can also layer colors over each other to get different colors. If you don't own the color that you need, you can do that pretty easily. Just be careful because the more you layer, the darker the color will be. The color system that Copic use for their markers is actually pretty useful and easy to understand. The first letter in the code represents the color family. For example, G equals green, Y equals yellow, V equals violet. They're pretty easy to guess. The first number is associated with the saturation. The lower the number, the more brighter and saturated it is. The higher the number, they are more desaturated and slightly grayer toned. The second number refers to the tone. The lower the number is, the lighter it is, and higher numbers are usually darker. Keeping the letter and the first number in the colors that you're blending together ensures an easier, natural looking blend, but you don't always have to keep in that constraint. Adding a little bit of variance gives colors a more dynamic look and also pops a little bit. However, the further apart the colors are, the harder it is to get a nice even blend. And finally, try out different papers. You will get different results when you use different paper to color on. If your colors are bleeding outside the lines, or if it gets a weird sticky texture when you layer over and over and over, it may actually be the paper you're using, not the markers. I prefer Express It blending card, but I've also used mixed media paper with good results, and I've heard a lot of people also use Bristol board. One paper I actually do not like is the thin bleed-proof paper, because it doesn't absorb the ink and you can't really layer too much with it. I also prefer a heavier paper as well, and the one I just mentioned is quite thin and flimsy. So there's a little collection of tips that I have for Copic markers. This video is less of a tutorial and more like just some random tips that I thought that I might share with people. And yeah, I just thought that I would give it a go and see if people liked this kind of video. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I shall be back in my next video for some more art. And yeah, make sure you hit like and subscribe, and I will see you in my next video. Bye everyone!